Warning, this video will contain spoilers for the prologue of Final Fantasy XVI, as well as all 8 seasons of Game of Thrones. The reason why we're even comparing them in the first place is because of an article published by IGN at the end of 2022, stating that Game of Thrones may have had an influence on the development of Final Fantasy XVI. A comparison that triggered a debate within the video game Twitter space, with one tweet in particular calling Final Fantasy XVI Game of Thrones is the same level as calling everything Dark Souls. It's just people showing themselves that they only know this one thing as a frame of reference and think that they can be cleverly snide about it. To which well-known video game journalist and YouTuber Jeff Grubb replied, "I guarantee you that HBO's Game of Thrones was central to the pitch of Final Fantasy XVI. We're gonna go back to be like the thing that is very successful today is the most normal thing in the world for selling ideas inside of corporations." However, the most popular argument still being brought up today by the Final Fantasy fanbase, even after the full release of FF16 on June 22nd of 2022, it's crazy how they constantly scream Game of Thrones, even though Final Fantasy had been doing Game of Thrones decades before Game of Thrones was on HBO. This tweet, and the argument in general, refers to two games. 1991's Final Fantasy IV, released on the Super Nintendo, which is famous for being a pioneer in the implementation of dramatic storytelling in JRPGs. However, the second game is Final Fantasy Tactics, published in 1997 on the PS1, which tells an epic war saga with dialogues written in an Old English style to fit its medieval fantasy setting, and tackles mature themes such as religion, politics, betrayals, and xenophobia. But fast forward to May 2023, when Eurogamer had the opportunity to speak directly with Naoki Yoshida, the famous producer of Final Fantasy XVI, who is commonly known as Yoshi-P, famous for having saved the dying MMORPG Final Fantasy XIV and helping it become the #1 MMORPG in the whole world. During this interview, Yoshi-P confirmed that there is a strong influence of Western fantasy too, Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones especially. That's new for the series. It's not just the greedy medieval setting either. Clive and Torgal parallel Jon Snow and Ghost. There's a new character similar to Hodor in Cid's Hideaway. And then he went even further when he added that we wanted to create something that really resonated with a lot of people. And when we saw how Game of Thrones, and before that, the Song of Ice and Fire series, really resonated with players, we knew that this was something that we wanted to do as well. When we first started creating the game, we had our core team of about 30 members very early on buy the Blu-ray box set of Game of Thrones and required everyone to watch it. Keeping all of this in mind, when a surprise demo was released 10 days before the official release date of the full game, I was actually shocked to have written down a total number of 20 direct Game of Thrones parallels. At that point, I had no choice but to make this video and share my findings. The first 5 references that we'll be covering are going to be based off the quote of Yoshi-P that Jon Snow and Ghost had a strong influence on Clive and Torgal. Number 1. Branded bastards. The game begins with Clive and 3 other similarly dressed men, who all bear the same face tattoo on their left cheeks. They are referred to as the Bastards, a unit of trained assassins whose mission is to kill an enemy dominant. We also learn that their face tattoo is actually called a brand, describing all the members of this unit as branded men forced into some kind of slavery, branded and turned into slaves because of how they were born, forced to live a life or everyone else around them sees them as inferior people, the brands serve as a constant reminder that they are to be treated as lower life forms by society. In a parallel manner, Jon Snow is introduced in the pilot of A Game of Thrones under the title of The Bastard when he meets Tyrion for the first time. Tyrion introduces to the viewer the concept that bastards in Westeros are seen by society as largely inferior than other people due to the context of their birth being born outside of wedlock. Jon reminds him that his father is Ned Stark, the most important man in the North, which Tyrion quickly counters as irrelevant in the context of Westeros, telling him that the world will always see him as nothing other than the bastard. Telling him that he should get used to wearing that title like an armor that everyone can see, because that is how the people of Westeros will always judge him anyway, and similarly to his own condition of being born a dwarf within House Lannister. Number 2, Brotherhood of Outcast, is the parallel between the Night's Watch and the Bastards. Both those groups are made of people that have been cast out from society and forced to join a brotherhood where they will be made to fight against supernatural enemies where the odds of dying are extremely high. The Night's Watch does include mostly criminals who deserve to be there, but many other members like Jon Snow and Sam are just people whose family deemed unworthy and decided to send them there to get rid of them. We find out that the Bastards are also a brotherhood when Clive has to witness the death of a member of his unit and cries out to him, "Brother," obviously shaken by his death, similarly to how he would be shaken if he had seen an actual brother die in battle next to him. Parallel number 3, Nuclear Revelation, is another major similarity between Jon and Clive, which is a parallel between Jon's revelation that he is in fact a dragon rider born Targaryen, and Clive's revelation that he does in fact have the power to be a dominant. In both cases, their powers give them the ability to rain down fire upon their enemies with a power that is akin to a nuclear weapon. This is another major parallel with FF16, where the Aekons are described to be the most powerful and deadly creatures in the world of Valisthea, where dominants are like dragon riders who have the ability to call upon the power of the Aekon they're bonded with and destroy anyone who challenges them, which leads dominants to be given a status similar to royalty in some nations. Parallel number 4, the Heirs' love and admiration. Joshua Rossfield and Robb Stark share many similarities. First, they're both the legitimate heirs of their respective families, and both truly love and care for their brother. They also both admire and recognize that Clive and Jon have skills and qualities that would make them the perfect legitimate heirs instead of themselves. In this scene, Joshua tells Clive that he thinks he doesn't have what's necessary to be the heir and that it should have been him who was chosen. In Book 3 of A Song of Ice and Fire, Robb Stark having a conversation with Catelyn Stark right before the Red Wedding, stating, "A king must have an heir. If I should die in my next battle," Robb said. "You forget, my father had 4 sons." She had not forgotten. A Snow is not a Stark. "Not unless he's legitimized by a royal decree," replied Robb. "Jon is more a Stark than some lordlings from the Vale." Number 5, Magical Pet Wolf. Torgal parallels Ghost as confirmed by Yoshi-P. So, Torgal is discovered in the Frozen Northern Territories, which in Game of Thrones is usually where direwolves are found. He was also found separated from his pack, half-starved, shivering in a snowfield. In episode 1, Jon Snow discovers Ghost farther away from his litter because he had been separated from his siblings, in the books stating that since he was the first to open his eyes, he wandered off and then ended up alone, half-starved, shivering in a snowfield. Number 6, Caring Siblings, describes how Clive and Jill, paralleling Jon and Arya, are both pairs of characters that demonstrate a deep bond and care for each other, even though they're not real siblings. In the books, Arya Stark is the only one of the Trueborn Starks who doesn't have red hair. Robb, Sansa, Bran, Rickon are all described as being more Tully than Stark and looking like Catelyn. However, Jon and Arya are both described as having all the physical characteristics of a true Stark. The fact that they share this black hair color sets them apart from the other siblings. In FF16, Annabella and Joshua share the same blonde hair color, showing that Joshua is more like his mother, whereas Clive has the black hair of his father. So does Jill, which gives them something else that they have in common. However, both pairs of characters show the most similarities when they have to say goodbye to each other early on in their respective stories in a very similar scene where Arya and Jill end up crying. Arya Stark has always shown that Jon was by far her favorite brother, and Jon obviously thinks of her as his favorite sibling because she's the only one to whom he gives a gift to and promises to see again, telling her sometimes different roads lead to the same castle. Similarly to how Jill is shown to have difficulty saying goodbye to Clive, she ends up praying for his safe return, during which she gets emotional, ending up shedding a tear for him. Now, I'm not sure if their relationship will become romantic in the rest of the game, or if they will remain treated as brothers and sisters. But in the next scene, Clive is shown wanting to hug Jill when she gets cold, which he doesn't end up doing, but it does seem to show that there may be some romantic feelings there and that they may be more than just brothers and sisters in the future during the game. But even if that happens, Arya Stark and Jon Snow were originally supposed to fall in love in the original outline of Game of Thrones. George R.R. Martin confirmed that at the end of the first book, he left the door open for a possible relationship, but decided not to go through with it. So Yoshi-P may have been aware of this fact and decided instead to make Jill and Clive end up in a relationship. I'll find out when I play the game. Number 7, Royal Hostages, is actually sticking with Jill, but this time paralleling Theon Greyjoy. I was actually kind of surprised to read Jill's active Time Lore description, stating that she was taken as a ward because she was a princess of a northern territory whose homeland's incessant raids were quelled by the duchy, being Elwyn Rossfields, who raised her alongside Clive and Joshua, just like she was his own daughter, remindful of Theon Greyjoy, a boy of 10, whom, after the Greyjoy's rebellion was crushed by Ned Stark and Robert's rebellion, Theon ended up having a very good relationship with the Starks and ended up coming to consider Robb as a younger brother. Our 8th parallel today will be Heinous stepmothers, which is Annabella Rossfield paralleling Catelyn Stark. In her active Time Lore description, we're told that Annabella is the mother to Clive and Joshua, which I assume means biological, as well as also being described to treat Clive with nothing but thinly veiled contempt. A contempt that we quickly get a taste of when we witness the first interaction between Clive and Annabella. She gives him a heinous look that is not subtle at all. That look immediately reminded me of the first interaction between Catelyn and Jon in Game of Thrones. And we know that Annabella also hates Clive, just like Catelyn hates Jon, because she's always trying to convince Elwyn, Clive's own father, to stop giving him any importance in the family and to stop giving him any role in the family. Annabella goes even further when she calls Clive a worthless man, a failure, a man like any other. Another parallel between Annabella and Catelyn. Catelyn Stark in the books tries to convince Robb not to make Jon a legitimate Stark. Jon is a brother of the Night's Watch, sworn to take no wife and hold no lands. Those who take the black serve for life. If I send the watch 100 men in John's place, I'll wager that they find some way to release him from his vows. I know you trust John, but can you trust his sons or their sons? If you make John legitimate, there is no way to turn him bastard again, should he wed and breed. Any sons you may have by Jane will never be safe. At which Rob replies, John would never harm a son of mine. To which Caitlin says, no more than Theon Greyjoy would harm Bran and Rickon. Greywind leapt atop the crypt, his teeth bared, sensing the enemy. Rob's own face was cold. That is as cruel as it is unfair. John is no Theon. Our 9th parallel will be again with Annabella Rossfield, except this time it's the family of the Rossfields paralleling House Targaryen. Annabella Rossfield is now being described in her time lore as having been proposed as a bride to Elwyn, even though the two are cousins, which the reason being exactly like for the Targaryens, they want to preserve their bloodline, and ever since a young age, Annabella knew that that was her purpose in life, to keep the power of the Phoenix inside the Rossfields' bloodline. This is a perfect parallel to how in House of the Dragon, we learned that Rhaenyra Targaryen is being courted and receives a lot of wedding proposals, and she states that they only want her Valyrian blood for their offspring to have the chance of being a dragon rider, and maybe even given a dragon egg by House Targaryen to put in the newborn child's cradle so that the dragon and the baby would grow up together. Which is why in the next scene we find out that King Viserys ends up deciding to marry her to her cousin Laenor, who is already a dragon rider of sea smoke. And by doing so, he is uniting two already dragon-riding families. The Valyrian and the Targaryens are both from Old Valyria. They've been allies and mixing bloodline for generations. So what King Viserys is doing is keeping the dragons inside those two families because he knows that other noble houses are becoming more and more bold. And one dragon could push them into a rebellion. We finally made it to the halfway point and parallel number 10, which is one of my favorites. Ancient Magical Gates is the reference to the Black Gate from A Song of Ice and Fire. In this case, the Phoenix Gate from Final Fantasy XVI, which is a very important location, is a direct parallel to the Black Gate from the books. And let me show you why. Built to be an outpost in the war against the northern territories. The first thing that popped to my mind at the beginning was Castle Black, and how Castle Black is the main outpost that was built against the battle of the northern tribes beyond the wall. But then I realized, now there is another castle that fits this description. The Night Fort, being the first abandoned castle by the Night's Watch thousands of years before the year 0 of the Targaryens. It's located near Castle Black, being castle number 7. Now, the Night Fort is very special because very deep beneath its ruins is a black gate, a magical black gate that is the only other way other than Castle Black to cross the wall to the other side and go from the south to the north. Almost no one is aware even that this gate exists, and is made of white weirwood with a face on it. The weirwoods being the representation of the old gods. And the door that allows access to this gate will not open unless a member of the Night's Watch repeats a part of his vow. I am the watcher on the walls, I am the fire that burns against the cold, the light that brings the dawn, the horn that wakes the sleepers. I am the shield that guards the realm of man. The door will open and only then will say, then pass. I am told that you and this wildling girl passed beneath the wall through some magic gate, said Stannis Baratheon. The Black Gate, Sam stammered, below the Night Fort. This concept of the Phoenix being able to hear the words of the Duchy's forebears and allowing access to the chamber is very, very similar to how there is a talking weirwood tree, basically an old god, who gives access to a gate only to specific people. Parallel number 11. It was Moss, the Chronicler, who said is how Final Fantasy XVI begins. Moss, the Chronicler, is telling the story, which is a parallel with Aegon the Informer being myself. And I am here to tell you to please like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. I know right now it's only World of Ice and Fire content, but I'm actually planning on starting to make video game content.
Looking for. And yeah, I never watched Game of Thrones either, so I don't have that reference point. And I know a lot of people. If 10 people who I know and trust are telling me, it's like, oh yeah, this is real Game of Thrones, I'm like, okay, yeah.
I mean, there's even like some stuff in there where they've just pulled like names from things. I mean, obviously, Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire are definitely very heavily entrenched in a lot of British historical stuff.
Sure.
So there's a lot of things in there, but there's some stuff.
Flying real close to the sun
I
on that.
I think the one thing for me, like
Names that fly too close to the sun. First, the Iron Kingdom is definitely a reference to the Iron Islands, because the people of the Iron Kingdom are called the Iron Blood, very similar to the Ironborn, and the Men of the Fist definitely parallel the Fist of the First Man, even though I don't think they have anything to do with each other from what I know, but the names definitely parallel each other. So that's number 13. And number 14, this one they didn't even try, with the twins being literally a reference to the twins from The Crossing that House Frey sits on, which is where the Red Wedding happens. And in FF16, the city of Twinside is commonly called the Twins and located at the closest crossing point between the continents of Storm and Ash, exactly like the Twins in Westeros. And also, last but not least, the Lord Commander of the Shields. Now, I'm not saying the parallel are the words Lord Commander that exist in other fantasy stories, but the Lord Commander of the Shields definitely parallel the Lord Commander of the King's Guard. That is because the King's Guard are symbolized by a white shield, and the Lord Commander of the Shields has a subunit called the Shields. I think you see what I'm getting at. Number 16 is also related to nouns, except this time it's quotes that parallel Tywin Lannister with an individual that we find out is called Hugo Kepka and is the dominant of the Titan. In this scene where he says, "Does the lion take care when he chases the hare?" he's obviously referencing Tywin Lannister's famous quote that says, "A lion doesn't concern himself with the opinions of the sheep," aggravating Jaime, obviously. And then we also see Benedicta call Hugo, "You're a lion, you're my lion," exactly like Shae is calling Tywin Lannister in that scene when Tyrion discovers her in his bed. The 17th parallel is global warming, which is a parallel between the Blight and the White Walkers. The White Walkers are, of course, not global warming. This is a reference to an article from around the time Game of Thrones was still airing. And somebody asked George R.R. Martin if he alluded to climate change when he created the White Walkers. And he replied very kindly, like, climate change right now, that's ultimately a threat to the entire world. This is something that can wipe out possibly the human race. It reads that the spread of the Blight has forced the goblins to move nearby human settlements, a move that's often misunderstood and ends up in bloodshed. The Blight is mentioned again when talking about the Northern Territories. With the Blight encroaching on their territory evermore, the remaining tribes were united and pacified by Archduke Elwyn Rossfield of Rosaria. So I went to the Mako Reactor, being the glossary of the Final Fantasy franchise, and it describes the Blight as a creeping darkness that makes large pieces of land unlivable for human beings. Parallel number 18 is very linked to this, being a doom-driven unity between the wildlings and the northern nations. So basically, just like we said, the remaining tribes were united and pacified. This is exactly like Mance Rayder, who, with the following quote, basically says the same thing. "Do you know what it takes to unite 90 clans half of whom want to massacre the other half for one insult or another. They speak 7 different languages in my army. The Tens, which were in the picture at the beginning of this parallel, hate the Hornfoots. The Hornfoots hate the Ice River clans. Everyone hates the cave people. So you know how I got moon worshippers and cannibals and giants to march together in the same army? I told them we were all going to die if we didn't go south. Parallel number 19. The one before last. Ned Stark being an obvious parallel of Elwyn Rossfield, where we see Joshua being very young and having to witness the death of his father right in front of him, is very reminiscent to how Sansa basically in the background having to witness the death of her father, whereas Arya, thank God, was spared to have to witness that. And we have gotten to parallel number 20. Blazing Harbinger is the last parallel between the Red Comet and the Red Star. In Final Fantasy XVI, this red star shines beneath the moon. They call it Metia and consider it to be a message bearer as well as a beacon of wisdom. Jill prays to it, wishing Clive a safe return because he claimed to be too old to believe in the Red Star's power. However, before Jill arrived, he's seen staring at it and then says, "This is it then, time to prove yourself," secretly wishing to the Red Star for the strength to be able to succeed that mission. However, all of this means nothing, and I wasn't going to include this parallel until I saw this clip.
So there's an accompanying song that comes out with 16 by a Japanese artist called Kenshi Yonezu, and the song is called Moon Gazing, and so the moon plays like a really key part in this game, and certainly Clive's relationship and Jill's relationship to that moon. Heard it here first, guys. Heard it here first.
In the first episode of Season 2 of Game of Thrones, Daenerys is shown staring at the sky and notices a red comet. This episode is the only time in the HBO adaptation where we see this comet. However, in Book 1 of A Song of Ice and Fire, a Game of Thrones, the red comet in the books makes its appearance in this final scene of the TV show in the last chapter of the book. Jogo is the one who spies it first and says, "There." Dany looked and saw it. The first star was a comet, burning red, blood red, fire red, the dragon's tail. She could not have asked for a stronger sign. This red comet is the reason why she believes that she has to walk into the fire where the corpse of Khal Drogo and Miri Mazdur are burning. Then, in Book 5 of A Song of Ice and Fire, I have seen it in the flames, read of it in ancient prophecies. When the red star bleeds and the darkness gathers, Azor Ahai shall be born again, amidst smoke and salt to wake dragons out of stone. Bran is the only other character in that episode who is shown noticing the red comet, thinking that it meant an omen for Robb's victory. Osha herself says she heard some people theorize that it was a sign for the Lannisters' victory, because it was Lannister red. Then says, this time, a theory from the stable boy, who believes it symbolizes Ned Stark's death. But then she adds her own theory, stating that the red comet symbolizes the birth of dragons. Which to the reader at this point is the most logical explanation, who knows that it's a pretty big coincidence that the red comet showed up in the sky at the same time as Daenerys' 3 stoned dragon eggs magically came back to life. So the theory of the comet symbolizing the birth of the dragon would also have to mean that the prophecy is talking about Daenerys, who fits all the characteristics at this point for being the princess who was promised. However, George R.R. Martin doesn't like prophecies. In many interviews, he said prophecies can be a tricky business, a double-edged sword. You have to handle them very carefully. I mean, they can add depth and interest to a book, but you don't want to be too literal or too easy. Please like, comment, and subscribe. I am Aegon the Informer, and you have been informed.